Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the launch of the KPMG 2021 Fourth Industrial Revolution benchmark, produced in collaboration with Fathom. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wongal people of the Eora Nation in my case, on whose land we meet, and pay my respect to their elders both past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians who may be joining us today. On behalf of KPMG, I also extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for today's event, wherever you may be. My name is James Mabbott, and I'm a partner in the firm, and my focus is on exploring new business models, future trends, and innovative technology to drive growth in response to disruption. And today's topic, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, certainly embodies this and more. So we have today a fantastic lineup. And in terms of the agenda, I will give a brief overview of the benchmark itself and key findings. Michael Prittis, CEO of Fathom, will then share his thoughts on what this means in terms of Australian industry and our workforce. My colleague and fellow KPMG partner, Shane O'Sullivan, will then host a panel discussion with distinguished guests, including David Spence, Chairman of the IoT Alliance Australia, Elizabeth Wilson, CIO of the Victorian Department of Education and Training, the Honourable Niall Blair, Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University and Chairman, New South Wales Biodiversity, and Chairman of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust, and Dr. Amanda Caples, Victoria's lead scientist. I will then be back to provide a brief summary of the key discussion points and lead a vote of thanks for our panellists. I should also note, in terms of the slides today, as you see them there on the side, you can make that panel bigger too if the text is too small, and we will be sending out after today's presentation the report itself as well. So if you miss any specific numbers or detail, it will all be made available to you. So now to the core of today's discussion, and let's start with a brief reminder of what we mean by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We are talking here about the emergence of digital physical systems, described by Klaus Schwab as a fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. This industrial revolution is perhaps best characterized by technologies such as AI, blockchain, IoT, quantum, and big data, but we also explore in the benchmark areas where a combination of these technologies may work together in systems such as digital twins, autonomous vehicles, and 3D printing, to name a few. And you can see the suite of technologies that have been explored here on the slide. In terms of the respondents' profile to this year's benchmark, the profile itself was similar to last year with a couple of notable exceptions. First was that the number of organisations in the benchmark has increased significantly from 196 to 336 participating organisations. So we have a much larger sample. And second, we had a much higher participation from companies in the health and manufacturing sectors, leading to much more diverse industry representation this year as opposed to last year's benchmark. So what then were the key findings? At a headline level, there is a sense of increasing unpreparedness amongst organisations when considering the adoption of Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies. The key potential use case, though, continues to be in improving customer experience. And I say potential because even though participants report a broad familiarity with the technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, implementation is at its best immature when you look at the benchmark. And sitting behind this hesitancy, despite a strong increasing desire to adopt these technologies, are a number of key challenges, with access to skilled workforce being a key barrier. Alongside this, the complexity of legacy technology environments, organisational change resistance, and unclear or absent technology strategies create further barriers to adoption. All of which means we have a benchmark that shows companies are still early in their adoption, with cloud computing being a notable exception. Surprisingly, with the adoption of digital technologies accelerating through the pandemic, we yet to see this reflected in the benchmark itself. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion today because I suspect that may be one of the themes that Shane wants to dig into. The benchmark also shows that companies with a larger turnover or high awareness of fourth industrial revolution technologies tend to be further up the maturity curve. On an industry basis, we see health as a notable laggard relative to financial services and manufacturing in terms of maturity. But as I've noted earlier, regardless of this, the vast majority of Australian organisations are yet to make significant steps in terms of investing into these technologies. And when they do, investment and adoption is most likely to be driven by a need to drive improved or superior customer experience to boost productivity, or to develop innovative and game-changing innovations. Given the tag revolution, I personally hope that in time we see less focus on augmenting today's business models and an increasing emphasis on the new opportunities these technologies open up. Inherent in the innovation opportunity is potential to address some of the more pressing challenges of modern society and some of the darker legacies of our modern industrial landscape, such as climate change and social inequalities. To achieve this, though, this game-changing innovation or significant acceleration and improvement of existing business models will require investment in skills and capabilities. It will take real leadership to lean into and grab hold of the promise and opportunity that fourth industrial revolution technologies represent. Leaders need to be prepared to take risks. Our policy settings will need to encourage investment, so not just business, but political leadership at a national level. And finally, it means having a strategy and a game plan for how, where, and when to make the best use of these technologies and what role they should play in helping to drive outcomes for business, for society, and for our national prosperity. So with that in mind, I now invite Michael Prittis, CEO of Fathom, to share his thoughts on what the benchmark means for Australian industry and our workforce.
Thank you, James. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike, I'm the CEO of Fathom. We're delighted again to have worked with the team at KPMG on this joint assessment of the fourth industrial revolution and how Australian leaders are meeting the challenges and the opportunities of this period. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to introduce this work, and I thought I would focus on the key finding that James talked about first, which is this issue of unpreparedness, and share with you 3 stories of how our local clients are doing exactly this so that we can all leave this call with some tangible examples of what we can all do immediately. So it's not new to say that COVID was a slingshot for automation. We've seen these examples again and again through different industries here in Australia and worldwide. But I think this story is not more powerfully told than by highlighting the growth of a robotic process automation company called UiPath. In 2015, they had 20 staff. In March last year, they listed at the New York Stock Exchange for $37 billion. And clearly that shows the response and the way that companies around the world are using them. One of those companies is Woolworths. And Woolworths are using UiPath to look at robotic process automation, a range of other technologies as well. But not only has the largest Australian employer thought about automation, but about a year ago became a Fathom client, and earlier this year announced a $50 million reskilling and upskilling fund, with the CEO, Brad Banducci, featured in Fairfax Media in February under the headline, "No Team Member Left Behind." What we're seeing here is an example set by Australia's largest company, saying where we use these technologies, we understand, again, one of the points that James mentioned, which is the impact on skills development. We've seen this too in our work locally with government. So last year, then Treasurer Perrottet launched the New South Wales Treasury's 2021-2022 Intergenerational Report. We work closely with Treasury's Chief Economist in preparation for that report and content within it. And there's a reason why, when the then Treasurer Perrottet spoke to launch the report at the media event, that skills development was such a fundamental part. Treasury is now working on policy to look at how we instill and equip New South Wales particularly, but clearly more widely, Australian employees and citizens with the skills they need to be part of this fourth industrial revolution. The third example is to help meet this reskilling need. The University of New South Wales recently set up a new business called Horizons. And rather than me try and summarise it, I thought I'd use their text because they've nailed it. New South Wales Horizons is a full circle partnership for ongoing rapid skill building at scale, linking skills development efforts to business impact. Here again, we're seeing how academia, in this case the University of New South Wales, but it's happening across many universities, has recognised the impact and the opportunity of the fourth industrial revolution. So drawing these to a close and looking across the report of what the kind of key common denominators are, yes, we're seeing a degree of uncertainty. Yes, we're seeing, as James mentioned, this topic of kind of people feeling a bit less prepared than they might be. But we are seeing the leaders in industry, in government, and in academia start to realise that the common denominator solution for many of the fourth industrial revolution challenges and opportunities is the reskilling and upskilling of their employees and citizens, so that all of our people, regardless of who they are and where they are, can be part of this fourth industrial revolution future. So I hope that's a helpful way to introduce some of our observations, and now I'd like to hand back to Shane and the panel.
Terrific. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, James. Firstly, thanks to everyone who's joined us today, and in particular to our four panelists. We've got some amazing representatives of fourth industrial revolution experience here, and it's going to be a fascinating topic of discussion today. Given the makeup of the audience that we've got almost 300 people that have joined us, and an amazing range of people from company CEOs, C-suite executives, non-executive directors, technologists. We're going to try and pitch to everyone and make sure that we cover not just technical questions, but also a lot of the business implications and organisational implications of the fourth industrial revolution. So hopefully there's something in it for everyone. Before we get underway, just want to reintroduce our panelists and to give you a sense of the passion for what we're discussing today. I've said, keep the introductions brief, Shane. Let's get into the meat of the discussion. So I'll just kind of reiterate, we're joined by David Spence, who's the chairman of the IoT Alliance Australia, Amanda Caples, who's Victoria's lead scientist and director of Breakthrough Victoria, the Honourable Niall Blair is Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University, and also co-chair of the New South Wales Circular Economy and Research Task Force. And finally, Elizabeth Wilson, who's the CIO of the Victorian Department of Education and Training. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Look, without further ado, why don't we get into the panel discussion, but just start with a kind of a rangefinder. There's a lot of people in the audience who appear to be from less technical backgrounds. I thought it'd be good to start with a view in terms of how you as a panelist might define the fourth industrial revolution and its potential impact for Australia. Maybe David, if I could call on you as a first respondent to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Shane, and thanks KPMG for the report today. I just think we're entering the world of science fiction, and it's arriving very quickly to us. We're seeing digitization of everything. We're digitizing railroads, we're digitizing farms, we're individuals, we're digitizing homes, we're looking at states, municipalities, and all layers of digitization happening across and around the rest of the world, and connecting through interoperable means with the rest of the world. This level of digitization is just happening so quickly, and we can see it particularly in our agriculture. A lot of digitization happening on farm, a lot of use of AI to services. We're seeing it well in the smart city area, and this is happening at an unprecedented rate. The membership of my organisation, the IoTAA, is growing by tens of members a month as people around what this means for us in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. Just for reference, the line was a little bit patchy. I don't know if some of that weather that's come through might be impacting your Wi-Fi, but just for those that might have had a challenge. Sorry, David.
It's absolutely bucketing down where I am at the moment.
Yeah, no, that might be a slight challenge. Okay, thank you. I'll just replay. So there was an emphasis there on the digitization, really, of everything. What that means is where data was not available historically, it's absolutely available now. So we've got the means to produce data to track, health, wellness, machinery, the environment, and so on. But we've also got the means to be able to digest that data and act on it, and all the mechanisms to be able to enable that as well. I just wondered if Amanda, whether you'd like to provide an alternative view, or maybe agree with David in terms of how you're seeing the fourth industrial revolution.
Thanks, Shane, and hopefully the weather is kinder here in Melbourne at the moment. So look, I agree broadly with both, obviously the framing of the report and also David's comments, and for those on the webinar today who are not technical, my background is actually in the health and medical research and pharmaceutical space, and so I sort of see the fourth industrial revolution as being something that has been 25 years in the making to be an overnight success, and in fact, we're really on that trajectory we're on a journey to get there, and of course some of these technologies are very well developed, and others, particularly AI and the application to blockchain and the variety of other applications that are swept up in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, are at that earlier stage of maturity. And over the next decade, we'll be seeing the use case for these technologies as we become more familiar with them, as we have, as we create the workforce that understands not only the technology, but as importantly, if not more importantly, how to put them together in a way, in a shape, and at a point in time for the right applications. And that's something that I think we're just at the beginning to understand how to use this suite of technologies.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. Maybe, Niall, if I could turn to you. One of the things that is a complicating factor in terms of understanding the fourth industrial revolution is it's not a single technology that is encompassed by it, as opposed to previous industrial revolutions where it was steam or electricity, for example. Do you see any particular technology as being, of standout importance, or key technologies that people should be considering?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Look, I think the answer to that is really driven by the individual business, because I think what's important to one business is going to be different to others. And I think that's also even changed probably within the last couple of years within businesses. If I put on my director hat from the mushroom industry, I would probably tell you now that robotic mushroom harvesters are probably the thing that we see as the most important, coming off the back of the restriction of movement of staff to pick our mushrooms during COVID, and just seeing some of the New South Wales WorkSafe statistics coming out this morning on how many staff have actually had put in workers' compensation claims for catching COVID in the workplace, probably starts to skew some towards the robotic side. I think autonomous vehicles, again, probably a COVID-related impact on what we're seeing across the country at the moment, trying to get the winter crops off and harvested, restriction of the movement of people, lack of labour. Autonomous vehicles may be at the forefront for some organisations. But I think more broadly, when I talk about agriculture, we're not just looking at better decision making, but we're also looking at tapping into some of those sustainability objectives and benefits that come with the sector. And that's going to require the collection, analysis, and then application of data. And I think that's probably one area that we can see has a really broad application, whether we're transitioning our agricultural sectors from a lineal economy into a circular economy approach. We need to measure material flow and be able to validate changes and see what's happening there. And I guess the other thing that sort of is a spin-off from this is that it's not just the areas that we've identified as the technologies in that fourth industrial revolution that are going to be the opportunities. It's then what those technologies need that sit underneath them and service them that are also other opportunities. And for example, when we talk about data, when we're talking about sensors, we're talking about technology ecosystems that are driving and running businesses and processes through a supply chain, there's a huge role for us now to move into cyber protection in the ag sector. We're now seeing different risks to the meat companies threatened through ransom. We'll see the next level of activists maybe moving into this space rather than just trying to shut down a production system. They may use an attack coming through these technologies. So I would say robotics is probably a driver, autonomous vehicles, data, and then the spin-off from that is making sure that that is protected, validated, and being able to be used. So I think there's something in it for everyone, and each business will decide what's more important for them.
Fantastic. Thanks, Niall. And maybe Elizabeth would love your view on that as well. I guess partly in your role as CIO for a government department, but also giving your agencies support for the Victorian economy and a lot of the private sector organisations in that. Do you have any views on key technologies that you think should be relevant on people's minds for the fourth industrial revolution?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Niall just said about data. Certainly in the education sector, one of the really important technologies is artificial intelligence. The ability to ask the question, to look at data and identify patterns in data that answer questions we haven't even sort of worked out to ask yet. Certainly in education, in schooling, we see artificial intelligence as it's the only way you can look at personalisation of learning for students. No teacher can possibly, with a class full of 30 kids, can identify the learning patterns, etc., of every individual child. But data will enable that to happen with artificial intelligence applied over that. So I do think it is very much an industry-based thing. We could also say things like virtual reality and augmented reality are probably going to be really important, particularly in the K-12 space for younger kids in looking at educational experiences for them that engage them in their education. We know that engaged students do so much better. There's we have lots of examples in schools. In teachers actually applying technology in quite amazing ways, in ways that we wouldn't have thought of previously. We've put out Minecraft education editions being used in Victorian government schools. Most people would have thought that, that'll be applied for, sort of teaching kids how to code or whatever. But it's being used in more of the humanities, teaching kids to work together in teams to build worlds and how you actually act in a world and the rules, etc., that you need to establish in a virtual world. So definitely, I think data is at the bottom of it all. We need the evidence. Most of those technologies use data, and without that, most of them are pretty useless. So I think, anything that enables us to harness data and actually, analyse data is going to be important.
Yeah, no, I certainly know from virtually all the clients that I deal with, rather than thinking about each of these technologies as independent silos, it's the ecosystem of how data is generated, how it's then deciphered and used to augment decisioning, and in a lot of cases then autonomous actions taken out of it. So it's getting those systems set up, and that can look very different depending on whether you're referencing a bank, a government organisation, a hospital, and so on. We've got a few questions coming in from our audience. So the first one starts to touch on, I guess, some of the leadership challenges associated with the fourth industrial revolution. And the question is the lack of employee skills that was called out as one of the challenges in the survey compounded by leadership immaturity in implementing the fourth industrial revolution technology or outcomes. So maybe a question is around, do we think Australian leaders are well equipped to deal with the fourth industrial revolution? Maybe Amanda, could I turn to you for first response?
Thanks. Thanks, Shane. Look, I think it depends on the sector. Like, we've seen a great uptake in leadership, for example, in the mining sector of these kinds of technologies, and we've heard in the introduction from Mike about Woolworths and others. So I think we're starting to see it in major corporations, and that's because they've got the capacity and the capability, and I think that government is starting to catch up, and I'll use a couple of examples. So here in Victoria, we've started as government agencies to start using the technology, particularly in the infrastructure space, to to improve, to move into the 21st century in terms of not only building new projects, whatever they might be, but also in structural health monitoring. So I think there's a role for those sectors that are more advanced to start talking about what they're doing. And I put government in that category as well, because we are a major part of the economy and important for us to demonstrate, like Elizabeth has talked about in terms of the education sector. So the remark was made before about the healthcare sector, and coming out of COVID, being able to draw upon that experience and expand upon that will help others, I think, to understand the use case for them in their context. So, yeah, I think there's a real leadership from the opportunity for those who are best placed and are more advanced to bring the broader economy along.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. And David, I guess you obviously get the opportunity to interact with a lot of organisations in your role on the IOTAA. How well prepared do you see Australian leaders to deal with the opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution?
Not preventing the innovation in the space, which is a very good thing for the country. However, it is a race. And one of the big impacts of this fourth industrial revolution is velocity and volume. And you can see in the payments industry where 10 years ago, if we had to transfer $1,000 between all of us here today from one to the other, it probably would have taken a year through the check systems or whatever previous systems we had. Today, we can do it a lot faster through our sort of mobile phones and others. We can transfer one to another. We can transfer it. We'd probably get it done in a couple of days. Okay, with DeFi and with blockchain and AI, the future is and the future is very close, we can probably do that in minutes, hour. We'd get around the 300 of us that are on this call today in an hour. So the increase in the velocity and the volume of money creates this massive liquidity. Now, some countries will adopt earlier than others, so they'll get more liquidity than other countries. And it's whether our leaders can get across the impacts of competing against other countries around the world where this rapid change in the velocity and the volume of money is happening. And these are the things I think we need to start addressing.
And David, just following up on that, one of the things that might be of interest is where we see Australia relative to other countries. Do we think we're lagging, and if so, really creating a disadvantage for Australia? Or do you think we're doing a good job of keeping up and maintaining competitiveness?
I think we're doing, as we have always done, we're doing a very good job of adopting quickly in Australia. The key for us is whether some of these technologies we can lead in. And I think in agriculture and others, we're certainly seeing a lot of digitization, which is ahead of the rest of the world. In some of the smart city areas, we're lagging. We're lagging France and other European countries in that space. So I think it really depends. This fourth industrial revolution covers a lot of things. I think in some areas we're doing okay, and like Amanda said, in mining, we're certainly doing very well in mining, but in other areas we are way behind.
Fantastic, thanks, David. And maybe we've used a number of examples of major organisations, be it government departments or large private sector organisations. Niall, I was just wondering, as part of your experience, do you see the fourth industrial revolution being as applicable to small to medium enterprises as it is to large organisations?
Yeah, absolutely, because they need to be part of the broader supply chain and ecosystem right throughout the country, whether they're small, medium, or large. I think the challenge for them is trust more than anything. I think, again, when we have conversations with farmers around data sharing, for example, there's no lack of data, as David has said, in agriculture at the moment. Every machine we operate, every sensor in a paddock, it's all spitting out data. And I think that smaller organisations can be fearful of this. And I mean, one of the projects that we're working on that the KPMG is actually the program lead, is looking at how we can actually have a data exchange through the agri-food supply chain that will allow some of those very easy transactions to happen, whether it's looking at biosecurity or provenance or even transactions that need to go through the supply chain. And that will require every supplier to eventually come on board to that. So we do need the smaller businesses to be involved. They are involved in other areas where we do see the exchange of data. Our simple merchant facilities that our banks use, and a customer using a smartphone or smartwatch pay option means that they are part of that ecosystem, whether they actually know it or not. We just want to see similar types of examples rolled out. And I think that trust is one issue that is a barrier to that. I think we do need to do more on the conversation around data ownership. For, again, in agriculture, there's people out there telling farmers they're going to make a fortune off their data if they sell it. The flip side to that is they're fearful of people getting their data and trying to sell it back to them or sell a product back to them. So absolutely, the smaller businesses need to be involved. They are part of that broader ecosystem. I think they need to know where they fit, how they're protected, and what is in it for them and the benefits. And I think that's part of the challenges going forward.
Yeah, fantastic. I know from what we see, a lot of these technologies are surprisingly accessible, and it was good to see that cloud was noted as being one of the technologies that had the highest level of maturity or familiarity. And the reason why I say that is we see cloud as a gateway technology. I think a lot of people think of cloud as providing kind of just the basics, the storage or some compute power, but there are some amazing services that the major cloud providers provide. Things like machine learning algorithms or computer vision, maybe IoT related capabilities. And many members of my team will access these for their own benefit with the swipe of a credit card. So I think a lot of this is very accessible to small to medium enterprises as well as larger enterprises. And I think the differentiator is not how big you are in a lot of cases, but your attitude to trying and experimenting with the technology. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to comment on that, if that's what they're seeing or if they see it differently. Yeah, Amanda?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Look, I think SMEs are really, really important, and there is an initiative in process that I think will be something that can increase the adoption of these technologies by SMEs, and it relates to a federal government program, so the Digital Economy Strategy, which was released earlier this year. So it's a federal government program. There's currently a process to establish AI hubs around the nation. And so from a Victorian point of view, we've been engaging with our stakeholders to understand and characterise what an AI hub might look like here in the state. And so through those discussions, we've been talking with a variety of experts, particularly in the field of AI, who've raised that one of the primary issues for small businesses, whether they're farmers or SMEs in a manufacturing sense, is having the data set, so sufficient data in order to readily access the value of these technologies. And so I think that's a really, really interesting area where more work is going to be done so that SMEs with smaller data sets are able to confidently engage and adopt the technologies by working collaboratively with the researchers along the way. So I'm not sure that it's here now. It could be, and by all means, if please tell me if it already is here. But it's an area where I think it's an opportunity for growth, and to the point that was made earlier, Australians are great technology adopters, and you just need to show them the way. And if that, what I understand is a small hurdle, can be overcome, then it could sort of break it open in terms of accessibility for industry more broadly.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. I might move on to a topic that's associated with the fourth industrial revolution as a bit of a concern, particularly for people that aren't close to it, and that's some of the ethical dilemmas presented by it, particularly I think with be it data that's produced, how it's handled, and even some of the ethics of what control do you give to the machines, and some of the decisions that might end up being made by machine as opposed to by person. So I guess Elizabeth, if I could invite you, with respect to some of the ethical challenges associated with the fourth industrial revolution, do you have any advice for executives grappling with ethical issues, particularly as what you would see as some of the key ethical issues and how they might grapple with them?
We're grappling with them ourselves at the moment. So I think, it's really important to understand that you need to have a position on how you apply these technologies. And I think that's, once again, it's probably relevant to the industry you're in. With us, we're dealing with data and creating a digital presence for very young children. And how do we, things like biometrics, there's a lot of fear. Some of the studies show that that's probably one of the technologies that people most fear, because it's about you as a human, and it sort of touches on the human aspect of it. I think, we're looking at now creating some policy around the use of some of these technologies, and particularly artificial intelligence and biometrics. Artificial intelligence, the bias that can be built into algorithms is something that's got to be really sort of looked at. And also, as you suggested, where does the human take over from the artificial intelligence? Where does the decision making and what decisions are made, and whether they're made by sort of technology or whether they're made by humans. So I think there's an awful lot of work to be done. It'd be great to see from a government perspective some real attention being paid to this space around government, because trust was mentioned, and trust is extremely important in the use of some of these technologies, particularly when we're providing citizen services. So we need to be transparent about this. We need to have, I think, some fairly strong positions about this if we're going to expect the public to trust us with their data and what we're doing with their data.
Fantastic. Thanks, Elizabeth. And Noel, maybe getting your view as well. If you're maybe in an executive or a board position for an organisation that is using a lot of these technologies which are producing potentially sensitive data or algorithms that are taking over some decision-making responsibility, do you have any kind of tips of the trade that you'd suggest other execs or leaders consider to make sure their organisations are safe and their staff, customers, and so on are safe as well?
Look, I think the methodology that leaders should be making their decisions by in this space is no different to how they assess their risk appetite and fulfil their duties to the organisation in other areas as well. Remembering we're just talking about tools of trade here that we're applying into our business that come with opportunities, risks, and everything else associated with them. So whether it's a director or an executive, I think the same processes are there. We need to inform ourselves about the opportunities and also the risks associated with it. We need to get the best advice, particularly because not a lot of our executives, for example, or even our senior leaders may have the expertise in this background. So we need to go out and make sure that we are well informed and making the right decisions. And I think then fulfill our duties to make those decisions in the best interest of our organisation, our people, our stakeholders, our customers. And this can be quite challenging because we are moving into areas that we maybe don't know a lot about, and it could throw up many options. And as leaders, we're always faced with those questions around whether it's ethics or impacts, and we need to make the decision going forward. We also need to understand the barriers to maybe unlocking the potential of these technologies as well. And sometimes those barriers sit within very simple things within our organisations, whether they are procurement policies or maybe one or two specific areas that are a blocker. I was in a forum yesterday in Wagga. We had Minister Fletcher there, and we had the NBN Co, and we were talking about enabling the digitisation of our farming sector. And a young entrepreneur who invents equipment to help Wi-Fi signals to be replicated across farms stood up and said, yeah, but you've got a legislative barrier here. You've got legislation that doesn't allow Wi-Fi from a private farm to go across the boundary onto the next farm. So on one hand, we've got government saying, hey, we want productivity increases here and embrace these technologies, but we haven't gone back and done the wash through to make sure that when we are making the decision and telling our executives go forth and conquer and make this a reality, that we haven't also asked to make sure that we've unlocked the barriers, check our procurement policies, make sure that our purchasing requirements are going to enable this, make sure that anything else that could be an impact has been addressed. So that's a bit of a roundabout way of saying that it's a tool, it's a decision-making process, but we should treat it like we do with the others and be well informed. And that may mean that we need to bring extra expertise in to take that leap of faith, because we may not have it internally within our business. So we should go and seek the best advice possible.
Fantastic. And maybe, David, we've touched on government policy as something to be mindful of in a couple of the responses. Do you think, as Australia, we're doing a good job in terms of policy keeping up with a lot of the technology trends?
A bit of yes and no again. In a way, it's good to follow the technology and not to try and lead it, because that could dampen innovation in this new space, this fourth revolution. But that, just referring to the comment that Neil just made, that really, the telco world is really outdated at the moment when it comes to this fourth generation. I mean, that particular issue of Wi-Fi, according to the carrier code, you can't do that, you can't pass it on. Now, there are very good reasons why we have a code for carriers, but then you've got a whole lot of these private enterprise networks happening, and the law hasn't caught up yet, and it's a complete confusion at the moment in terms of IoT. So, yes, we do have problems. I think the government is starting to look at them, but they are very complex because of these many layers of digitization that we see in any particular thing, whether it's an individual, a house, a suburb, a municipality, or whatever. Who's owning that data, and where's it getting controlled, and how's it getting into new derived data, where we take existing data and we derive new data from that data with other data, and who owns that sort of data. So the rules around data are getting fairly complex at the moment, and there is actually no legislation around data, and I think that's going to cause some complexity down the road.
Any tips from yourself or our other panel members, if you're kind of confronted with maybe a policy or a bit of legislation that you think is not kept up to pace and inhibiting your ability to be the business model that you want, how to address that?
I'm happy to have a go at that. I think in the first instance, many of these things are unintended consequences, or, as David said, just the rate of progress being so fast that just the legislative or regulatory frameworks not being able to keep up. So my suggestion would be to work with industry associations to feed back to the relevant level of government. And maybe I'm speaking from a position of, experience, but typically policymakers are keen to get business intelligence, because their role is to, bearing in mind that they need to balance a whole set of policy priorities, get the best possible outcome, because we're all after economic development at the end of the day, and greater improvements in productivity, etc. And it's fair to say that it's often challenging to get that business intelligence. So I just encourage people to not assume that there's a barrier there. It just could be an information gap of policymakers, which is not to say that it's easy sometimes to navigate within government, but that's the role of the industry associations, and I really encourage people to use that as an avenue of getting a collective response, and then that will enable a faster policy response to the extent that that's possible.
Could I just back that up, having, I guess, the unique experience of spending 4 years as a minister in the New South Wales government, responsible for industry and even some of the programs that were helping to develop some of these technologies from a New South Wales government point of view. My 4 years went very quickly and seemed like a series of speed dates. We are, policymakers come with their own knowledge, their own biases, but ultimately they don't know what they don't know as well. And I couldn't agree more in that we need industry to be making sure that they not just go to the decision makers and tell them, what they could do differently, but also to highlight where industry is going and where the opportunities are, and sometimes where they want government to get out of the way as well. That balance between protecting a whole range of areas, but at the same time allowing innovation to occur, is something that does need to be nuanced, and we do need industry to play a role in that. So I wanted to reiterate that this is the role that industry can play, speaking to not just departments, but also decision makers, and helping educate them to see how they can enable and help this revolution to be embraced and drive our economy forward. We should and could lead on this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Niall. We're starting to get close to the end of our time, but still got one or two topics I'd like to try and explore. I think we've spoken about workforce, and I think that how the Australian population kind of responds to this. Maybe Elizabeth, starting with students. Would you have a view on how we best educate students about the opportunities and potential of the fourth industrial revolution?
Yes, and I think we're certainly seeing. I'm seeing it as an employer of those types of sort of capabilities at the moment, where COVID-19's had a considerable impact on us because of the closing of borders. So we don't have, access to as much capability as we've had in the past, and it's really become problematic. But yeah, from a student perspective, I think we have an incredible role in preparing our kids for what the future world that they will live in. But it's interesting about whether you teach kids about specific technologies, or whether you teach them about resilience, adaptability to change, those sorts of capabilities, rather than about specific technologies, because by the time they're in the workforce, the technologies will probably be quite different to the ones that we're talking about right now. So, trying to predict what the world they'll be living in the future is pretty difficult. But I think we also have in the education system more broadly, that we have a role in understanding the reskilling, and the Woolworths example, I think, was a great example, is the reskilling, the continual reskilling of the workforce, and understanding that you won't have a student who goes to university, does a degree or master's, whatever, and then goes into the workforce and that's the end of their education. That education will be something that is a lifelong thing, and that people will need to continually re-educate and reskill themselves.
Fantastic. Thanks, Elizabeth. Maybe David, if you were speaking to an organisation and you maybe had a concerned workforce, what would be your strategy for balancing introducing new technology, but looking after the needs of that workforce?
I think Elizabeth had hit it there. Absolutely, resilience. Things are going to change quickly, and I think everybody needs to be resilient and very adaptable to work, because we don't know what's coming around the corner and how fast this is going to happen. So I think those are the key skills that we need going forward. The technologies of today, Elizabeth's quite right. I mean, a lot of them are going to change on us in the next few years. we can just see with DeFi and the effect on the banking industry, how that industry is going to be dramatically affected, just like the media industry was affected by the internet. So I'd echo Elizabeth's words there, that it really is about resilience and adaptability.
Fantastic. And I guess what we see is, trying to make opportunities for people in areas that they may not have initially felt comfortable in, and just getting them to break the ice in new areas. It also builds up a self-confidence and resilience, as you've said, and helps bring people on along on the journey. I'll look to wrap up and hand back to James with one final question. So quickly for the panel, what makes you optimistic about the fourth industrial revolution? If there's something that our audience could take away to say, oh, here's something that I can pursue, any final suggestions? Maybe starting from my right to left. So Amanda.
Yeah, so look, I think it's really exciting. So we're on the cusp of breaking through in terms of the application of the technology. So at the end of the day, it's about wrapping the technologies around the problems that you want solved. And the good news is that help is on its way as we are getting greater familiarisation with these technologies, and through private-public partnerships, which are springing up around the country to help those companies and industries that are not there yet. And so you don't need to have it all internally, but you need to have access to that knowledge and skill base. And I think it's coming.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. Niall, if I could invite you.
I think one thing that's clear in the report is, well, a lot of this is here, and those that have adopted and gone early are the ones that are going to reap the greater benefits. So don't be the Blockbuster Video or the Kodak of tomorrow, right? I think that's the one thing that I would say. It is, the sky hasn't fallen. Those that have put their toe in the water, yes, they may be at a larger scale to be able to have done it, but they're the ones that are, I guess, the pioneers. They've sort of mapped the course for the rest of us to follow, and it's here. And if we embrace it, we will continue to evolve. And as I said, just I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, if I sat on the board of Kodak or if Blockbuster Video, what would I be thinking today? What decision points did what things were we presented to at the time that we didn't take up? That's where I think we're at the moment in a lot of these technologies. Yeah, let's embrace it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Niall. And David, I'm conscious of time. Have you got a final suggestion as well in terms of what to be optimistic about?
I think those companies that have a plan to look after their data and to know what data they need to survive in their businesses, those will be the survivors. And I think I'm pretty optimistic that all this fourth revolution will help us meet our net zero targets.
Fantastic. And Amanda, anything final from yourself as well?
Just to agree that the productivity improvements and the resource utilisation, because the decisions we'll be taking about what to repair, what to build, will be better informed by the data and the analysis of that data. So to David's point, could really help be part of what we need to do to change in order to meet the broader society outcomes like climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Fantastic conversation there. Some really insightful points. I'd like to hand back to James to wrap us up now.
And look, I'm going to keep this really simple because I'm conscious of our time contract. So firstly, I just want to echo the thank yous that Shane put out there. Thank you to the Honourable Niall Blair, to David Spence, to Elizabeth Wilson and Amanda Caples for that fantastic panel conversation. Thank you, Shane, for hosting it. I'd also just like to make special mention of Fathom and Michael Prittis, it's fantastic to work with Fathom as an organisation to publish this report. And the final question you may all be suffering from is, how do I get my hands on it? Well, you can see on the slide there, if you go to kpmg.com.au, the report is featured on our website now. We will also be emailing out a copy to all attendees who registered for the webinar as well. So thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to launch the report, and it's been a great conversation. Talk to you later.